Hello everyone. Welcome to my channel. Echo of Life. Let's start. There's a quiet kind of hurt no one really prepares you for. It doesn't come with noise or conflict. It arrives slowly, almost gently. One day, you look around and notice that the people who once felt like home now just feel familiar and far away. Not because anything went badly, not because of an argument, but because something inside you shifted. And the hardest part is this: you didn't mean to leave anyone behind. You just kept growing. Outgrowing people doesn't feel like victory. It feels like disloyalty, even though nobody says it out loud, because growth is supposed to be celebrated. Isn't it? That's what everyone says. Move up, move forward, be more. But no one mentions the quiet guilt that comes with changing while others remain the same. At first, it's subtle. Conversations start to feel repetitive. Jokes don't land the same way. The dreams you share are met with quiet nods or quick changes of topic. You begin to hold back, editing your thoughts, downplaying your progress, not out of pride, but because you don't want to make anyone uneasy. And that's where the guilt begins. A small voice inside asks, am I changing too fast? Am I becoming someone they won't recognize? Am I leaving people behind just by moving forward? Here's what's true but rarely spoken. Outgrowing someone doesn't mean you think you're better. It means you're no longer the same person who fit neatly into the old dynamic. And dynamics don't shatter, they fade. You used to bond over shared struggles, shared fears, shared frustrations. But now you're solving problems they're still sitting inside. You're asking questions they're not ready to face. You're choosing growth in ways they aren't prepared to follow. And suddenly, you feel out of place even though you're the one who changed. So you start to feel responsible for the distance, for the quiet, for the shift. But growth doesn't ask for permission. It happens. And still the guilt lingers. Because when you grow, you don't just gain insight, you gain awareness. You notice patterns you once accepted, emotional loops you once laughed off, behaviors you once let slide and can't ignore anymore. That awareness creates space. Not physical at first, but emotional. You're in the same room, but you're not in the same place. And the hardest part is you miss them. You miss who they were to you. You miss who you were with them. You miss the version of yourself that didn't overthink every word, that didn't feel bad for wanting more, that didn't believe growing meant losing. Because here's the honest truth. Growth always costs something. Sometimes it costs comfort. Sometimes it costs certainty. Sometimes it costs people. But we tend to romanticize growth, showing the highlights, the glow-ups, the wins. We rarely talk about the quiet nights when you wonder if you've become too different to belong anywhere. You ask yourself, why do I feel alone even when I'm doing better? Why do I feel guilty for wanting more? Why does moving forward sometimes feel heavier than standing still? The answer isn't that you're ungrateful. It's that growth separates before it connects. When you outgrow others, you enter an in-between space. You're no longer who you were, but you're not yet surrounded by those who match who you're becoming. So you drift, and drifting feels lonely. Old conversations don't fit, but new ones don't yet feel like home. And because you care, because you remember where you started, you feel guilty for the distance, even when it wasn't by choice. But here's something you need to hear. Outgrowing others is not an act of unkindness. It's a consequence of self-respect. When you start choosing honesty over ease, growth over familiarity, awareness over avoidance, some relationships simply can't follow. Not because the people are bad, but because the connection was built for a version of you that no longer exists. That realization stings. You never meant to hurt anyone. You didn't decide to leave. You just stopped leaving yourself behind. And that changed everything. This guilt feels heavy because we're wired for belonging. For most of human history, being alone meant danger. So when growth threatens connection, your nervous system reacts as if it's a loss, even if your mind knows you're evolving. That's why you second-guess yourself. That's why you wonder if you should slow down. That's why you sometimes think about shrinking back just to keep things peaceful. But peace that requires you to betray yourself isn't peace. It's postponement. And eventually the cost grows too high. You feel tired after conversations that once gave you energy. You feel misunderstood even when you're heard. You feel like you're either over-explaining or not speaking at all. And that's when guilt turns into grief. Because you're not just losing people. You're grieving futures that won't happen, plans that once felt sure, inside jokes that no longer land, dreams that no longer align. You're mourning something invisible, and invisible grief is the hardest to explain, especially when nothing went wrong. No fight, no betrayal, just change. And still the guilt whispers, shouldn't I stay loyal? Shouldn't I be grateful? Shouldn't I try harder to keep things as they were? But here's the quiet truth many learn too late. Staying the same to protect others eventually turns into resentment. And resentment slowly wears away love. You show up less, listen less, care less. Not because you stopped caring, but because you're tired of being somewhere you've already grown beyond. That person you're becoming deserves honesty. Growth doesn't mean forgetting where you came from. It means honoring it without letting it hold you back. Yes, some people will feel left behind. Not because you abandoned them, but because they chose familiarity over change. That doesn't make them wrong. It just means your paths diverged. The guilt you feel isn't a sign you're doing something wrong. It's a sign you're human. It means you care deeply. It means you're emotionally aware. It means you didn't take people for granted. But caring doesn't mean staying stuck. Here's something we rarely say.
Be careful.
Sometimes people don't miss you. They miss access to the version of you that made them comfortable. The version that didn't challenge them. The version that kept things predictable. And when that version changes, it creates unease. But unease isn't harm. It's an invitation. Some will rise to meet it. Some won't. And that isn't your responsibility to control. The guilt of outgrowing others often comes from a false belief that your growth somehow diminishes theirs. But growth isn't a race. Your evolution doesn't erase anyone's worth. It simply reveals whether you're still walking in the same direction. And direction matters more than history, because history alone can't sustain a connection. Only shared direction can. You can love people deeply and still accept that they can't go where you're going. You can honor memories without forcing a future that no longer fits. And you can feel guilt without letting it steer your life. Because if you shrink to keep others comfortable, you don't save the relationship. You just lose yourself quietly. And losing yourself is a far greater loss. Because if you shrink to keep others comfortable, you don't save the relationship. You just lose yourself quietly. And losing yourself is a far greater loss. In what comes next, we'll talk about how to carry this guilt, how to release it without turning cold, how to grow without disconnecting, and how to let go without letting growth become loneliness. Because outgrowing others isn't the end of connection. It's the start of a more honest one, beginning with yourself. And here's what no one really tells you. Once you accept that you've outgrown certain people, the guilt doesn't just vanish. Changes form. First, it's loud, keeps you up at night. But over time, it grows quieter and deeper. It appears when you're doing well and remember someone who's no longer there. It shows up when you laugh at something new and realize the old circle wouldn't get it. It comes when you want to share a win, then hold back, not from shame, but to avoid widening a gap that's already there. This is the guilt of growth, not because growth is wrong, but because it redraws the map of your heart. And the most confusing part is that no one is to blame. There's no villain, no betrayal, no single moment when everything broke. Things didn't break. They shifted. And humans struggle more with shifts than with endings. Endings are clear. Shifts are uncertain. When something ends cleanly, the mind can make sense of it. But when it fades slowly, the heart keeps trying to revive it. You replay talks. You wonder if you should reach out more. You ask whether you're being distant or just different. That inner conflict creates a quiet tiredness, because part of you wants to honor who you're becoming, and another part wants to protect who you once were with them. This is where many get stuck. They try to carry both versions at once. They show up halfway. They speak cautiously. They avoid topics that matter. They pretend they haven't changed as much as they have. And over time, that divide grows painful, because authenticity isn't optional for emotional health. You can only fake excitement for so long. You can only hide your growth for so long. Eventually, something gives, and often what gives is your peace. Here's what's important to understand. Outgrowing someone doesn't mean you stop loving them. It means the way you love them changes. Love doesn't always mean closeness. It doesn't always mean daily presence. Sometimes love means holding someone in your heart without holding them in your life. And that's one of the hardest kinds of love, because attachment feels like proof of care, feels like loyalty, feels like safety. But attachment can also quietly ask you to stay small, not because others mean to hold you back, but because familiarity resists disruption. When you grow, you disrupt. Not on purpose, not aggressively, just by being more true to who you are. And truth changes dynamics. Some people will lean in. They'll get curious. They'll grow with you. Others will step back, not from malice, but because growth challenges comfort. And comfort is powerful. So the guilt you feel isn't because you hurt anyone. It's because you're facing a truth many avoid. Not everyone who started with you can stay with you. And that truth feels lonely, even when it's necessary. But here's where perspective helps. Think of all the past versions of yourself you've outgrown. The child you were, the old beliefs, the fears you listened to. You don't feel guilty for outgrowing those. You feel grateful because growth means leaving something behind. Relationships are no different. They're living things. They either adapt or remain tied to a moment in time. When you outgrow others, it doesn't mean you're superior. It means your inner world expanded. You began asking deeper questions. You became more aware of your values. And that expansion created a gap that guilt tries to fill with a sense of responsibility. But you are not responsible for managing everyone else's comfort. You are responsible for living honestly. And honesty doesn't require harshness. It requires clarity. Clarity sounds like this: I care about you even if we don't connect the way we used to. I value what we shared. I'm not leaving. I'm evolving. Even if you never say these words out loud, you can live them quietly, by letting go of the need to over-explain, by releasing the expectation to be understood by everyone, by allowing relationships to settle into their natural distance. This is where guilt starts to soften. Not because you care less, but because you stop blaming yourself for changing. You realize something freeing. You didn't outgrow them overnight, and they didn't lose you suddenly. You grew slowly. They stayed where they were. Both can be true without either being wrong. What hurts most isn't the growth itself. It's the belief that growth always means loss. But it doesn't have to. Sometimes it means transformation. Some relationships settle into something quieter, less frequent, but still meaningful. Others fade completely, and that's painful but not wrong. And some surprise you. They reconnect later, when life has reshaped you both. Life isn't linear. Distance now doesn't mean distance forever. But forcing closeness guarantees resentment. So if you're feeling guilty for outgrowing others, ask yourself, am I honoring my growth or apologizing for it? Growth doesn't need permission. It doesn't need constant justification. You don't owe anyone your stagnation. You owe yourself your truth. There's another layer to this guilt that we seldom discuss. Sometimes outgrowing others brings up a deep fear. What if I end up alone? When familiar bonds weaken, the mind looks ahead and sees uncertainty. New connections aren't promised. Belonging feels fragile. So guilt whispers, maybe it's safer to go back. But safety without alignment is a slow wearing away. You might not notice it at first, but over time you start to feel disconnected from your own life. You show up, but you're not really there. You speak, but you're filtered. You smile, but something feels off. That internal divide costs more than loneliness ever could, because loneliness can be temporary. Leaving yourself behind leaves a deeper mark. Growth asks for courage, not just to change, but to sit in the space that change creates. That space is where new understanding forms, where new connections appear, where new ways of belonging emerge, but only if you don't rush to fill it with the past. The guilt of outgrowing others isn't something to erase. It's something to understand. It's the emotional echo of empathy meeting evolution. And that isn't a flaw, it's proof of depth. So instead of asking, how do I stop feeling guilty? Try asking, how do I grow with compassion without shrinking myself? The answer lies in balance, in honoring what was without clinging to it, in appreciating people without forcing closeness, in choosing growth without turning cold. You can wish people well from a distance. You can remember them with warmth.
I can see that.
You
Let's
can
fix
still
it.
care without carrying them.
Much better.
And that isn't abandonment. That's maturity. Outgrowing others isn't a failure of loyalty. It's a sign that your inner world is changing faster than your surroundings. And while that can feel isolating, it's also the start of finding deeper alignment, with people who see you as you are now, with conversations that stretch you, with bonds that don't ask you to justify your growth. So if you're carrying guilt right now, let this settle gently. You didn't become distant to hurt anyone. You became honest with yourself. And that honesty deserves room. Growth will always change who walks beside you, but it will also bring you closer to who you are meant to be. And in the end, that isn't something to feel guilty about. It's something to honor. Thank you, everyone. Please subscribe my channel. For more update,